Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I ngā mana, i ngā rau, i ngā karangatanga. Nau mai kia koutou te whare wānanga. Te whare a tūnei, tēnā koe. Te papa a tūnuku, tēnā koe. Tēnā kōrero, tēnā kōrero. I have just greeted you in Maori, and I've said welcome once, welcome twice, welcome to you all. I've also acknowledged this is a place of learning and acknowledged the heavens above and those that are watching over us spiritually in this afternoon and in this place of learning. What I'm going to do today is to talk a bit about some of the work that I did and talk about some of the cultural things in New Zealand, some of the journey we've had and some of the challenges we have and we still face down under. And I kind of think it resonates with a lot of what's already been said, because the challenges to work with young people effectively are really to think about where they are from and where they exist in their whānau, in their family and in society. And I just want to acknowledge Mary for the great work that she's done. It's pretty inspirational, to be honest, to be talking to one of my colleagues last night saying before she did set up Roots of Empathy, she did this whole other thing. And I felt tired just listening to the conversation. So I want to acknowledge her. But actually, one of the great things about coming this far afield is actually you meet a lot of amazing people. And it's been there's been a real synergy about with my colleagues who are presenting. It's kind of like sometimes you get together at these forums and it's kind of like guys are sort of, dogs, you know what I mean? They're sniffing each other and finding out where they're at and all that sort of carry on. But the great thing is we're sort of, we're just down there and just meeting heart to heart. So that's been, to be honest, that's been a wonderful experience. The first time I went to university, I actually was a university dropout, and I only lasted about 2 months, actually, and I wanted to be a geologist, and rather than cracking rocks, I ended up cracking heads, but I ended up training as a nurse, and so I've kind of come to psychology through that, but I've ended up obviously delivering babies and also helping people die in dignity. So I've and I worked in general hospitals, but also in forensics, so I've kind of experienced a whole lot of things. What do I do? Well, in many ways I see myself as a round peg in a square hole at university. I've been working clinically with kids for 25 years and I still do, to be honest. In fact, if you ask my colleagues at university where I am, I'm kind of never in the office. And my way of thinking, if I'm doing my job well, I'm not sitting in my ivory tower. So I do a lot of different things. Most of my work's done with kids. I do a bit of stuff with sport on the side just because I like sport and a bit of interest, but I also do a lot of stuff with police, etc. And I kind of think my reason working with kids is they're kind of real. And, adults can get a bit stuffy and a bit sort of stiff, and you can't, you know what I mean? And it's kind of like a lot of fun, and they actually remind you to be honest and who you are. So that's kind of why I've ended up working with kids. I started working with adolescents who sexually offend and with sexually harmful behaviours in the late 80s. And we used to do a lot of wilderness-based experiential therapy with them. And it's interesting that the minister talked about sort of learning by doing. And if kind of like you can imagine what adolescent who has done this, what adolescent A wants to go to therapy, they've got to be, it's kind of unusual in itself, talk to a person like me, and also actually talk about something that they're so shameful and embarrassed about and feel really, really stink about. And so what we did is we developed this program, and it basically, it was in a family counselling centre, and it started in response to the poor engagement of the young people and the families in working and talking about this issue. And it developed and we used to take these kids away for 10 days. It was pretty intense, and it was what I called psychology in the real world. And it's not what they taught us about university, but it kind of reminded me more actually of my nursing background, very hands-on, as opposed to sort of CBT and all that sort of carry on in the university. And what we did is we did a whole lot of experiential stuff, but we did a whole lot of group therapy as well. So we used to take them away hiking, caving, rafting, all these different things, because actually in 10 days' time, over 10 days, the behaviour and what they were and who they were as individuals became very, very transparent. And it was a very difficult, challenging work, and not everyone actually could cope with it. In fact, one of the times we got lost it was interesting. We were going down this bank, and I sort of was known to be slightly reckless. And I said, look, let's go down this route. And if you go down a hill steep enough, lo and behold, at a certain time, it'll end up turning into a cliff. So we were going, it was so steep, some of it was cliff, some of it was bank. One of my colleagues, Stan, he fell over and dislocated his shoulder, and it turned out that he'd done it a number of times. So we ended up having to look after him. Now, it's interesting that, and we stayed out overnight, we weren't prepared for it, we just slept under the stars, and they ended up getting the police and all this sort of carry on, but we were fine. And it's interesting, the kids found it fine, Stanley found it fine, but the other, one or two of the other staff that were there were really highly anxious and couldn't cope with it. And of course, it was a really, really interesting learning experience for the young people and also the staff in terms of going through what we did. We did actually do a lot of psychodrama and experiential drama therapy, and we used a lot of that to actually get the young people to understand about what it's like to be their victim and talking about victim empathy and actually doing it experientially. So it was very, very powerful work, and we were trained in, many of us were trained in very intense group therapy and psychodrama, and it was pretty interesting. You know, we used to sleep out under the stars, climbing mountains. Sometimes we would take guides. Many of the time we actually wouldn't do it at all. And it was interesting. It was based in an article in Child Abuse and Neglect. And these days they'd never publish anything sort of like that. You know what I mean? It's really hard to get into that journal. But it's very interesting. And my colleague Les Simmons, they had 5 levels in this article, and if you want to get the copy of the article, and it was very, very basic, very rudimentary. But from that, Les Simmons adapted that, and then we took it further, and it was really quite inspirational and inspiring work. So that's kind of a bit about me and some of my background. But today I thought we'd talk about the cultural context, the key issues for young people in New Zealand, and what really needs to change, where we need to go. And I kind of think there'll be some of it will be quite transferable, I would hope. So what happened in 1840 is that the British came in and they signed a treaty with the Maori, who were the indigenous population in New Zealand, and they came there. They're basically the First Nations people. And the British came in and colonised New Zealand. And what they did is they signed this Treaty of Waitangi. And really what happened is we found that there was a disconnect between what the Māoris viewed and how they viewed it and what the Pākehā viewed. Now, Pākehā is the Māori name for European, that's me, and most of us here are Pākehā, I see. And what they had is the Pākehā had the main focus on Article 1 of the English version, which was interpretive, giving them sole authority of New Zealand, but ignored Article 2, which actually states the Māori could hold on to anything they wanted. So from this point on, there was actually at that time there was a disconnect, and not all the chiefs signed it, and not all the chiefs were happy about signing it. And of course, the notion of property was very different to a Pākehā person, a British person, as opposed to a Māori person who actually it was their land. And the concept of mana, now mana is like esteem, that's the word for it, and it's kind of like, you know, their land is tied up in their mana. And that's kind of, and whereas for, a Pākehā person like me, a bit of land, we buy, sell it, it's got no importance really to us. But actually for Māori, it's very, very spiritually and it's tied up to their whole sense of who they are and their whole well-being, and I'll talk about that later. So why did Māori sign the treaty? Well, they felt pressured. There is an expectation of the benefits from the British colony and the possibility that the actual Britain would actually assist the Māori. And also they had a great belief and they had trust in some of them did in the missionaries, and they suggested that it was like a biblical thing. It really meant for them, and they're very spiritual people. However, and it would also that they'd actually keep their land, so they would actually also still become their chiefs and be their chiefs of their land. However, of course, that actually wasn't the case. Māori today, despite being colonised, have shown, I believe, remarkable resiliency. They make significant contributions to society and cultures of which they're part, but they actually also teach us, like in New Zealand, us Pākehā, something about actually that the dominant Western paradigm, the dominant Western view, is actually it falls a long way short, and there's a lot that we can actually also learn and gain from being in partnership with them. Today, what happens in New Zealand is that it's written into law with all government ministries that they have an obligation under the Treaty of Waitangi and they have gone, the iwis are the tribes around New Zealand, and there's been a reconciliation of giving back land where they could, financial, obviously, compensation, and there's a big, huge push on the oral and written language, and apologies, and there's actually a whole negotiation with Crown, Moneyland, and that's ongoing, and that, I don't know how long, how many more tribes have got to go through, but it's been going on probably for about 20 years. So here we have young people in Kohongareos, that's where they're actually learning Māori language from preschool onwards. We have Māori TV, the land tribunal courts, Māori strategic plans across government departments, Māori iwi services for Māori clients, and also Māori political parties. So there's really quite a really strong presence. And I think one of the things is that actually we're quite a small country, and so in many ways you can't actually ignore it. When I was a kid and went to school in Dunedin, there were very few Māori there, and we really didn't really aware of it. But actually, even today in the South Island, all the schools there would actually have Māori as part of their part of their everyday learning. So it's really become a real renaissance, resurgence. And what we would say is that despite having many cultures in New Zealand, and we've had a lot of migration of different cultures, we actually are still a bicultural country. And so the first rights go to Māori. So that's very important for Māori and non-Māori. And that they're the tangata whenua. Now that means they're the people of the land, translated the people of the land. And so they actually have first rights over the land. And it's really understanding and recognising the importance of the two traditions and partnership. And that actually if we're going to exist really as a country and flourish, then we really have to acknowledge this and respect this. And that's kind of the journey which we've gone into really. And I don't think everyone's been comfortable with it. I make no bones about that, and not all parts of New Zealand would be. But we're on that journey, and we've come a long way, a long way. So if we talk about Māori models of health and wellbeing, and how does this relate to the young people we work with? So here we have a marae, okay, and the parts of the marae are very important in terms of spiritual well-being for the Māori. So that's a marae actually at Waitomo, and I've stayed on there a lot with the young people, and we used to sleep together. We used to take them away. These are the adolescents, stay in the same marae, it's like a big meeting house where they used to, where in a couple of hundred years ago, they would live. I've stayed on dozens and dozens of maraes. We stay there with the clinical psychology students as part of their training, and so and as well, that was obviously in clinical work we did. But there is parts of the marae relate to parts of the family, parts of the spiritual health, the physical health, and also the mental health. And this is the Whare Tapawhā model from Mason Jury, who's a professor actually in psychiatry, and he's really well known, really highly regarded. And that's the model that he brought up. Actually, it relates to it's not just a building, it relates to a person and their whole health. So taha wairua, which is the spiritual part, it's the most important requirement for health, and it's tied up, intrinsically tied up in a person's well-being. It's a capacity to have faith, to be able to understand the links between the human situation and the environment, but it's also seen as unspoken as well, and the belief in God. So if we were in New Zealand, we were having a conference, we'd always have like a pulpuri, where you'd have Māori people welcoming you on, there'd always be a karakia, there'd be a prayer, and we'd open with a prayer, and you'd always close with a prayer. And they'd be singing songs. I could have sung a song today, but I kind of thought you were smiling, and I didn't want to put your afternoon off. But yeah, and actually the belief that actually they are totally connected with the land, but also the sea, kaimoana, the sea, the rivers, etc. The mental health obviously is the holistic thinking. It's not that actually it's divided from the person, the land, the family. And it's a capacity to communicate, think and feel. The mind, body are inseparable, so it's all interlinked. The physical health also relates to issues about tapu, what is sacred and what is not. When a person is physically unwell, in some ways their rhythms are out of kilter. In some ways that's what they'll say, their rhythms are out of kilter. And parts of them need to be brought back into balance. The family is everything, and it's not the nuclear family, it's the extended family. So it could be aunts, uncles, And, they whāngai young infants where, say if I'm the mother, I might end up whāngaiing my daughter or son out to someone in my extended family who brings up, and that's quite a normal practice in Māori. But it's seen as it's the cornerstone in terms of everything. Everything relates back to the whānau, everything relates back to how you deal with it. And in terms of what used to happen is that the Māori young people would be taken off and put into foster care, into state care. What we found out is they'd be sexually abused, physically abused. And so now what happens is that where it's appropriate and they can be looked after in safety, adhered to, and they actually go to extended family members to look after them. And it's really about, it's really everything comes back to that. If we look at also about so that's the Māori culture. Now I wanted to move on to the Pacific culture, and particularly Samoan. So the reason that I'm going to talk a bit about this is because we had, New Zealand is multicultural, but Samoan and the Pacific Islands make a very important part of New Zealand society, particularly in the Auckland area. And here, if you look at it, and really this is what it says, it's like the physical, spiritual, mental, and other well-being all relate to the whālei and the culture and the family. And the family is the foundation. It's the fundamental basis of the organisation. And the history ties us to the titles, the land, environment, sea, gods of the Pacific. And that's all really interlinked. In some ways, there are a lot of overlaps between Māori and Pacifica, as you can see. The roof of the whālei is where the cultural values and beliefs are, and it's very important. Whereas the Western view will be quite individualistic, the Pacifica view is very much the community. It's very spiritually based. The church is very important, and actually the meeting house and the whālei all are a key part of the work there, and actually the family. The four poles of the whālei: spiritual, physical, mental, and other. So they really are how a person stands and whether they stand strong or tall or not. So what I wanted to do is, given that history of my work, of the Māori and Pacifica culture, what of young people in offending New Zealand? And I just wanted to run through about 11 key points that I think are quite still relevant and probably quite relevant for here as well. So it's been interesting, it's talked about today. So if we look at these things, the Otago Daily Times is a newspaper in Dunedin, but if you look at what Socrates wrote, and that was a few years before my time anyway. The children of today are tyrants. They talk back to their elders, slobber their food and annoy their teachers. And there are some excerpts from the Otago Daily Times in the 1800s. So we viewed actually that adolescence, it kind of tied totally back into what Jean was saying earlier. The point is, I think, that every generation seems to believe that those who follow are somehow less righteous, less moral, more poorly educated than they are. In almost every case, they are actually wrong. Some background points. I think kids that I've worked with chronic conduct problems, many of them are actually unresponsive to treatment, unfortunately. Many of them actually have poor prognosis, end up going, even with the best interventions, go through to the adult criminal justice system, and they have issues around mental health, physical health, etc. And it's intergenerationally transmitted. So why focus on child and youth offending? Because we know, and this is some recent stats from New Zealand, and I'd be interested to see what the Canadian ones look like, but basically we see a really sharp peak in terms of offending behaviour that actually goes down over time. And this is consistently being shown over years and years. So if we really want to actually help society and help those young people, it's a really, really sensible time to actually intervene, and really about prevention. We know that there are two groups of offenders, and from the work of Terry Moffat, what we talk about is adolescent limited. They'll age out of offending, they commit minor crimes, sometimes quite seriously. Many will stop offending, as the graph shows. Many of them are dealt with in New Zealand by diversion. Many of them involved in the Restorative Justice Family Group Conference, etc. And they tend to start later. They also, unfortunately, Māori are way overrepresented in the stats, and some of the youth courts, Māori are actually up to 90% of the young people in the youth court are actually Māori. And together with their families, they show a range of potentially substance abuse, transient, criminal behaviour, etc., unemployment, mental health problems, etc. That's one group. The other group are a group that you can identify really early, and this really ties into Mary's work in terms of prevention at a very, very young age. We know that actually there's a group of life course persistent offenders that you can identify probably around the age of 5, 6 and 7 years old, and that they start very young and they offend over a long period in duration and often quite seriously and violently, and they ended up in the adult criminal justice system. 80% are males, many of them are not at school, high rates of a whole lot of violent, serious offending. And this, most experience family disadvantage, trauma and abuse, neurodisability, some form of mental health problems. Both groups tend to commit serious offences, but the latter group a lot more seriously. So that's one point. The many forms of family violence and subsequent impact is something we have to address. I believe that most things come back, and I'm a simple guy, comes back to family violence and alcohol abuse. And if we dealt with those things, then we'd actually deal with a whole lot of things in terms of young people I work with. We have to target the top 10%, because those are the young people that really are the most difficult to intervene with, and we have to intervene earlier. We have to intervene earlier. Here's a graph from, that basically shows that they're the most prolific percentage of young people who offend. That's why we have to focus on the top 10%. And Terry Moffat's work, which have talked about the longitudinal study, using the longitudinal study from Dunedin actually, talking about, and she's talking about the life course of persistent offenders that basically end up through a whole drift of successive system failures, non-engagement, difficulty engaging, and ended up not just in the juvenile justice system but also psychiatric system as well. We have to prioritise a response to Māori offenders at every stage of the process. So we have around 60% of young people before them, the youth court are Māori. So young Māori offenders in New Zealand, many of them are being dealt with through specialised courts, Māori courts on the marae. So they actually go to the marae, they have a welcome on the marae, they'll actually have a Māori judge, a youth court judge who will address them and have restorative action. They do everything on the marae as much as they're able to. And so that's really where things have moved. In the last 5 years, that's a new initiative. So rangatahi courts, iwi social services, where the iwi, the tribes, actually run social services. It's by Māori, for Māori, and culturally appropriate and respectful services, and that the agencies, maybe they're run by Europeans, Pākehā, but they'll also be culturally responsive to Māori. So that's really where things are given a big priority back home. If there was one magic bullet, Judge Beecroft, the Principal Youth Court in New Zealand, would say it would be engaging in school and keeping them at school. We know that when they are out of the school system, they're on the streets, they're going after your property, they're going after you. That is a big problem, and that, as we see, is a big protective factor. Most of the kids that I see have been out of school by about the age of 11, 12 years old. So they're actually expelled. They've also had suspensions before that time. As Nelson Mandela would say, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And that's really why we're here today, obviously. We don't do this well. I think I've got this as a bit of a desert. What do we do with child offenders around the age of 8 to 12? And there are some young people, we've started off a program in South Auckland where, we're looking at the highest risk child offenders, and they're offending really seriously. Violent offendings, robberies, car conversion, driving up motorways the wrong way. This is not kids sort of pickpocketing or stealing stuff from shops. This is stuff that is really serious, and they are the group of life course persistent offenders. I think we've dealt with that really poorly so far. In fact, I think it's been inadequate back home. They're also the group of kids that we call the crossover kids. That's basically that, and as Jean talked about, these young people don't wake up one day and think, I want to be a youth offender, this is what I want to do. Most of them have experiences of neglect, abuse, and they'll come from the care and protection system into the youth justice system. So really, what are we doing? How can we more effectively create a better care and protection system, meet their needs when they're younger in terms of abuse, neglect, etc., so we can turn the tap down and protect them from going through to the youth justice system. So we know that really they are not kids they're not just naughty kids, they're kids with comorbid issues, learning problems, trauma, childhood experiences, mental health, but they also have actually a lot of strengths. And actually the kids that I work with, while at times they're incredibly difficult and challenging, they are still actually, there are still gems and they've still got a lot of goodness about them. That's really important to tap into when you're working with them. Jean nicely talked about neurological disorders, FAFD and TBI. Those are things that we really have come on board with. And actually there's some really good stuff going on in Canada, to be honest, in the FAFD world. So that's a really important area. The issue about alcohol and drug use is a real big problem back home, but I kind of think if we deal with the alcohol abuse, then that's going to be part of our problem solved. And what happens in New Zealand actually is they set up these small liquor outlets in poor communities, where the locals try to speak up against it and they don't. And of course the politicians don't want to actually say what the truth is, so it's easy access to this. Young people going and getting alcohol, families getting alcohol, it's just around the corner, it's in the dairies and that sort of stuff. And there's community pressures on to actually, it makes a real difficult problem. And what we need really is a whole family approach. Parenting schools, passivity, helplessness, disinterest, and really what are we doing about the siblings? What are we really doing about the family? Because I believe that there are coaches, our co-therapists, really our barometers and our key ingredients, and they're fundamental in terms of really, if we're going to change the young people, that's what we need to do. So what do we do? Really, what do we do when we have that snapshot? Well, if you were following closely, you would have thought Ian's gone to number 2 and not number 1. So number 1 is the key thing, and we really have to look at prevention. And really, how do we turn the tap off and then really address things very, very early, look at the young people that are at high risk, but also look at the young people that are getting abused and traumatised, and intervene intensively with evidence-based programs. We really have to do that. I think it's interesting that this was a slide I normally use for practitioner practices, and I chucked parenting in, because I kind of thought the whole thing's really all together. I think we have to model empathy, we have to be genuine, respectful, honest, and do as you would be done by, which means treat them as though you would want to be treated the same way. You've got to be flexible, but also be contained as well. You've got to be humorous, you've got to find and focus on their strengths, and I think you've got to laugh and laugh more with them. Because if you're too sterile and straight, it's going to be a boring talk at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's interesting, we talked about in sync this morning, and it was interesting, I had this slide, and I think there's something about getting the right relationship. I've got to be like a loving father, but also very firm and clear father. And for some of these kids, I'm their father figure. They've got gang affiliations, that sort of stuff. The father might be dead, totally not on the scene, and I'm their only stable father figure. And you really have to be in sync. But the kids who need the most love will ask for it in the most unloving ways. So these young people really, will be rebellious. They will present their attachment styles to you that really want you to push them away. But really, actually, they present to you in the most unloving ways, but really, actually, what they want is they want to be nurtured and cared about and supported and loved. This is the culturally responsive New Zealand, really. I think services need to be put in the village. We have cultural advisors in clinical teams, cultural advisory boards. On the boards of the big district health boards, we'll have that. Māori Pacific Services and court system, Pacific Services, and also a Pacifica Court, highlighting the importance of culture. And also in the academic world, we have research centres that aim to increase these and have separate Māori and Pacifica streams for funding for research. So that's really where we're really trying to push it. But the real gaps in New Zealand, despite all this, if you look at residential services, and Jean was talking about that, 90+% will be full of Māori kids. We have a lack of female specialist services for young females, really that are tailored to meet their needs. And there's still gaps in services, and really we don't have enough funding to evaluate the services. And I think, at the moment what we're doing is we're struggling with the age of criminal responsibility. So at the moment it's 17. And some of us have been really trying to push. And what I'm going to do when I was asked to speak at the Children's Commissioner when I get back, and I'm going to be saying that actually if we don't do this, we in the few generations' time, we're talking about a Maori youth justice system, not a Pākehā one. We're talking about it's a Maori youth justice system, and it largely affects Maori. So there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul in the way in which it treats its children, and we all need to be reminded of that. So we've just got one more slide. So I just want you to read that quietly, and then that ties us up. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.